Uh, Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Payne because it's 10:05 a.m. for him, where he's from. Welcome to yet another interactive session hosted by Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College. And today we have the privilege of hosting Professor Stanley George Payne, who is the preeminent theorist of fascism, uh, known for his typological description of fascism, as well as an authority on the history of modern Spain and the Spanish fascist movement. For the benefit of the viewers who may not have read his works before, Professor Payne is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he taught from 1968 until his retirement in 2005. Professor Payne has authored 27 books and co-authored, edited, and co-edited about 18 other books. Professor Payne's A History of Fascism 1914-45 is a seminal work in fascist studies, and it's an indispensable guide to understanding fascism in its global setting. In fact, if I might say so, when we were studying the history of East Asia and militarism in Japan, we did refer to Professor Payne's book, especially the chapter on fascism in other contexts. So it's not just with respect to European studies, but Professor Payne's work is truly global. His most recent book, Franco, A Personal and Political Biography, was published in 2014. Other than this, Professor Payne is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Association for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies. And today he'll be discussing his work, certainly on modern Spain as well as his work in fascism. The title that we had kept for this session was The F Word, Understanding Fascism. And this is a bit of a catchy title, but also the fact that the word has become so widely used in the political parlance nowadays, despite its historical roots being rather old, that it's all the more relevant to investigate and historicize this phenomenon and see whether we are using it in an appropriate manner. So, thank you very much, Professor Payne, for agreeing to talk to us today. And I'll hand it over to you then for your opening statement. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a genuine pleasure to talk to the students at Hindu College. My son will be leaving tomorrow on his annual winter trip to India. So this is kind of Indian week for me. And I had a Zoom interview with an Indian American graduate student at Georgetown University yesterday. So India is featuring very much in my own life this week. Let me begin with just a very brief introduction to my career and how I got interested in history and how I developed concern with these topics. I was born in Texas. Texas is part of the old Hispanic part of the United States. So I was exposed to the Spanish language very early on. But as I was a student later on in university, I was particularly interested in Russia more than in Spain. No one studied Spain as an historical topic in those days, whereas Russia at the height of the Cold War was a matter of great interest. But I was particularly drawn to Russian literature, not to Russian history, even though it was clear to me that I intended to study history and not literature and the arts. I had applied for a fellowship to the Russian Institute at Columbia University, then the best place in North America to study Russian affairs. But my application was held up in the mail, and I never received the fellowship. I went in another direction to Claremont University in Southern California. And since I already knew Spanish and did not know Russian, having read some interesting literature on Spain that summer, I decided that this would be the focus of study. The problem was that beginning as a graduate student in the history of Spain in the United States in 1955, well over half a century ago, people did not study the history of Spain. I was quite a novice and had to become an autodidact. But at Claremont, I had an academic advisor who had been to Spain 3 times, more than most Latin Americanists, and he suggested that I study the figure of José Antonio Primo de Rivera, who was the founder of the Fascist Party in Spain. I knew nothing about this at all. I had no particular interest in fascism, but I responded that it sounded to me like a good idea. So I developed a master's thesis on the topic and later went on at Columbia University to do a doctoral dissertation. And that book was finally published in 1961. That was the first of what I had no idea at that moment would eventually be a long line. Now, when I undertook the research project in the late 50s on fascism in Spain, particularly its early phase, mainly in the 1930s, I didn't know any more about fascism than anyone else. And frankly, I didn't really have any interest in it because fascist studies, as a general historical theme, developed only very slowly in the Western world after 1945. They're being done only in the 1950s with regard primarily to Germany and to Italy, but nothing more. Moreover, I went to Spain in 1958, at a time in which, of course, there were no historical archives open. I had to develop my own methodology. And what I found were that there were many veterans of the movement who were willing to talk and be interviewed, so that I undertook a research project based fundamentally on oral history, except that at that time, in the 1950s, we did not use the term oral history, and I had no training for it. So I simply had to learn to do it by practicing it. It's sort of learning to swim by being thrown in the pond. So this is what happened, but it turned out relatively well. Then after finishing work at Columbia, I taught 2 years at Minnesota and 6 years at UCLA, and have spent most of my time at the University of Wisconsin. When I began working on the Falange, the Spanish fascist movement, my definition of fascism would probably have been hardly as good as yours. That is, I would be able to cite certain commonly perceived characteristics, but I had no definition or philosophy of this and had to work it up from scratch. Later on in the 1960s, however, there did begin slowly among some Western scholars what has been called the fascism debate. That is, there was a realization, at least among a minority of historians, that the radical fascist, the radical nationalist movement, which we call fascism, had broader ramifications. That Italy and Germany, they're very different, also had things in common, and that there was a broader phenomenon of fascist politics, at least in Europe, during the 1930s. They developed the concept of what we now call generic fascism, that fascism was a general movement of revolutionism, like, for example, communism on the one hand or anarchism on the other, a different kind of revolutionary movement, and therefore all the more difficult to understand, to analyze, and to define. Slowly, I began to associate myself with the fascism debate. And of course, that kind of comparative history is something one pursues methodologically quite the other way around, the way I began in Spain, dealing with the veterans of the movement and practicing oral history. Generic fascism requires dealing with a lot of different countries and a variety of different languages and a great deal of reading. I first tried to write an essay in 1968 on the particular role of violence, but this was not successful. It was never published. Uh, I became more active in looking at fascism in general during the 1970s, and particularly in a conference held in Norway, Bergen, Norway, what is now the Institute for Comparative History at the University of Bergen in Norway on the social basis of fascist movements. I did have data on this and gave a paper on Spain and first tried my hand at a comparative analysis of fascism, which was well received. This led to my first fascist book, which appeared in 1980, called Fascism, Comparison and Definition, which tried to achieve a kind of overall definition and comparative analysis of fascism as a general phenomenon. And I think that sort of thing had really never been done successfully before the book in 1980. The 1980 book was a short book, only a little over 200 pages. It was not really a history. It was a kind of a work in political science, though I'm not a political scientist, simply an historian. But it was really a comparative politics, political science approach, and was generally well received, had a certain amount of influence during the 1980s. I realized as the years went on, though I was working mainly in the field of Spanish history, that still there was no complete general history of fascism. And the 1980 book, as I say, was more a work of political science, of analysis and theory and definition than it was of history. And so in later years, I developed the much broader general comparative history book that Pushkar has referred to, Fascism, a History of Fascism from 1914 to 1945. And that was my effort to raise fascism to the level of comparative history in a general format. After that, I began to deal in terms of international history, going beyond Spain, more in terms of the rival revolutionary movement of communism. And then finally, the little book that I published about 2011 on civil war in Europe, the revolutionary civil wars, fomented primarily, not exclusively by communism, that in some cases, in certain countries, led eventually to the rise of fascism. So that's the background in a nutshell. And let me change focus now to discuss the general topic of what we call generic fascism. Fascism is very much in the news nowadays because the use of the adjective fascist has become increasingly popular all over the Western world, and not just in the United States. I find that nowadays I do lots of interviews about the term in various contexts in the United States, but also by means of Zoom with other countries, not accepting, as we see the case of India as well, because there's a lot of interest. And the interest has been stimulated particularly by the candidacy of Donald Trump. Now we have a question here. Would you go ahead and ask a question?
No, sir, there's no question in the chat box.
Okay, very well. Beginning in 2016, and I've done a whole series of interviews over the last 8 years on the question, is Donald Trump a fascist? No, he's not a fascist. He's a populist who engages in a certain kind of rhetoric on occasion that reminds people of fascism. The imputation of fascist to the enemy is something that has a very long history, and as far as the United States is concerned, goes all the way back to the 1920s. Best book about this is a very short book by Professor Bruce Kuklik, who's a specialist in American history, about the use of fascism in American life. But you could write the same sort of thing about a variety of different countries as well. Fascistology by the 21st century is a kind of academic subspecialty. There is now in the United States and Western Europe an association of fascist studies. So they have their own association and are attempting now to bring out a journal. The kinds of definition and theory used here are very vague, very loose in the extreme. The idea of fascism in general as a political phenomenon is a generalization, an ideal type concept that really only operates at a very high level of abstraction. One of the problems here is that the fascist type movements were the most extreme forms of European nationalism. Each nationalism, as an autonomous nationalism, has its own emphases and its own characteristics, which vary a good deal from one country to the other. So there really has been no single fascist type. And when one uses the term fascism in general, small f, as distinct from capital F, which would be applied to Italian fascism, fascism small f as a generalization is an abstraction and an ideal type. Concretely, fascism in general, as a single entity, never existed. Fascism is a conceptual and verbal abstraction. When we use fascism with a small f, we're dealing with a kind of Weberian ideal type. So that some historians, not all, because some disagree, some historians want to use the concept of generic fascism, as I do, as a common set of extreme revolutionary nationalist movements, most radical in European and in Western history, with certain common characteristics. The problem is, there was never any single fascist model, never one individual single overarching fascist model, so that each fascism had rather its own characteristics. And one can talk of the generic ideal type only in terms of a certain limited set of central characteristics, and not in terms of an absolute single model. This is totally different from communism. Because communism, for an entire generation and more, was really established in only one power, the Soviet Union, which established its own model, completed its own revolution, and created the communist ideal type in what the Soviets called Marxism-Leninism. So communism had a model, a single model, and a single ideal type. And then, of course, with World War II, this was imposed on a variety of countries in Eastern Europe. That was also transplanted to other areas in East Asia and around the world eventually by the middle and latter part of the 20th century. So you have a big difference between fascism and communism. In communism, you have a single model. You know what communism and communist model is. You don't know for sure what the fascist model is, because the differences between Italian fascism and the most important kind of generic fascism in National Socialist Germany were absolutely profound. So much so that some historians say that you had really two kinds of radical nationalism in Europe. The Italian fascist kind, which was more moderate, more civilized, if you like, and the extreme radical, highly destructive German Hitlerian National Socialist kind. This is a fundamental problem. You can't get away from this problem because there is no single fascist model. So I repeat again, that one can talk about the idea, the concept of generic fascism only at a certain high level of abstraction, recognizing there are very considerable, in some cases, profound differences between the individual fascist models. Therefore, does it really make any sense to talk about generic fascism? I think it does, in terms of certain common radical characteristics, their authoritarianism and their radicalism during a set period primarily in European history. One can speak of generic fascism as a European phenomenon at this high level of abstraction for a period of about 20 years, coming to an end in 1945. Fascism, however, without a single model and without profound imitators in other parts of the world, was not a general political pattern, and historic fascism came to an end. It self-destructed because of extreme radicalism. The Hitlerian model was even more extreme than Soviet communism, so that it self-destructed and was largely annihilated in 1945. And yet, ever since the end of fascism, because all really serious specific fascism came to an end in 1945, the word has been ever with us. In terms of the political imagination, the Western world particularly, and some areas outside the Western world as well, still live in the era of Adolf Hitler. They live in the era of Adolf Hitler because they think of Hitler as having been an absolute epical phenomenon and a determining prototype whose shadow falls across all of modern history. And one thinks of Hitlerism as absolutely the worst of all kinds of revolutionary politics. The Soviet Union, for example, committed many crimes, enormous violence, many millions of deaths, due to the government of the Soviet Union. And yet the general imagination is that Nazi Germany was more destructive, more murderous, more homicidal, more nihilistic than anything in the Soviet Union, and Hitlerism becomes the ultimate in what you can call the demonic in politics. And the general term for this sort of thing, coming out of the propaganda of World War II, again, comes back to the word, the adjective fascism. Hitler was therefore, according to the concept and the propaganda of World War II, a fascist, though Hitler never used the term. Not a single occasion in which Adolf Hitler ever called himself a fascist, and is used for this kind of politics, really in a kind of extra or hyper political sense of something that is not merely undesirable, worthy of condemnation, too extreme, too destructive, something in politics that is simply demonic, totally beyond the civilized pale. You can say that this kind of dictatorship is bad, that kind of dictatorship is bad, but unless they're fascist, they're not fully demonic, though they may have created or committed even more crimes than historic Italian fascism. So the term fascist is used in a very vague way to refer simply to the demonic in politics without practical empirical definition, and is applied very vaguely by all kinds of different people in quite a variety of different countries, basically to refer to their political opponents whom they wish to denounce. That is, it functions only as a pejorative, not a precise descriptive term. The result has been that since 1945, particularly, and even to some extent before that time, the word fascist has become what linguists call an empty signifier. That is, it doesn't really mean anything very specific, unless you want to call Hitler a fascist, which he never did. He never used the term. Unless you want to call Hitler a fascist, we don't know what you really mean by that. Because to say that, to use Benito Mussolini as the prototypical fascist is not really very helpful. First of all, people don't know much about Italy, don't know much about Mussolini and Italian fascism. And then when you look at Mussolini, you find that he hardly ever murdered his political opponents after he came to power. He put them in prison on a special penitentiary island, but he didn't kill them. He became part of the European peace movement. He was, for nearly 20 years, pro-Jewish, a supporter of the background of Israeli nationalism in Palestine as an anti-British device, not anti-Semitic. The Italian fascist movement was disproportionately Jewish. That is, disproportionately so in the sense that the percentage of Jews as fascist party members for nearly 20 years was distinctly higher than the percentage of Jews in the Italian population as a whole, a disproportionately Jewish movement, because fascists were patriotic and middle class, and Italian Jews were very patriotic Italians and middle class. So they're naturally set up to become disproportionately fascist down to 1938. As I mentioned, Hitler was part of the European peace movement, cooperated with the other powers, and even in the very earliest years was rather anti-Nazi. Therefore, given this demonic notion of what fascism means, that has dominated the last half century and more, in precise empirical terms, you'd have to ask the question, was Mussolini even a fascist? He and the Italians created fascism, but they didn't have the full Hitlerian characteristics. So the real fascists are not fascist, according to the way the term fascist is thrown around in the 21st century. So the word really lacks very precise empirical content and is simply used as an all-purpose pejorative to denounce one's enemies. In another age, one would have some other adjective, some other kind of noun or term to do that sort of thing. In our age, historical reference is fascism, whatever that means. Most people have no idea what it really means, could not define the term, even if they use it. And the ultimate reference point really is not to fascism, in the sense of Italian fascism, but to the totally demonic, the extra political in political radicalism, as represented by Adolf Hitler and fascist Germany. This is the kind of conceptual problem we have. Nonetheless, I think it is possible, as I've argued in 2 books now, to talk about generic fascism at a level of abstraction as a form of revolutionary nationalism having certain characteristics. These don't have to do with the things normally thought of as fascist, that is, a dictatorship, a charismatic leader, an extreme nationalist movement, the use of a lot of irrational propaganda, the practice of violence, the killing of people. All these kinds of things have been done by all kinds of dictatorships. These are not uniquely fascist characteristics. You'll find them in Europe, you'll find them in some parts of the Middle East and in Asia, and you'll even find them to a small extent in Latin America. They're not uniquely fascist characteristics. You can't say, oh, Trump has a tendency to be authoritarian, he must be fascist. First of all, the extent of Trump's authoritarianism is considerably exaggerated because a personality like Donald Trump is fundamentally incoherent and goes back and forth on everything and is not really consistent about anything to speak of, except his kind of American populist nationalism. And so to use the term fascism in any coherent way, one has to extract from the movements that may fit into a general ideal type of generic fascism what really is different. It isn't being quite radical. Say it isn't being authoritarian. It isn't being violent. It isn't being a dictatorship. It isn't being xenophobic. You'll find these things in many different countries, many different kinds of political movements, many different kinds of dictatorships. So what can one extract conceptually and empirically from the European fascist movements to say really are characteristic of fascism that make fascists fascist? Not very much, actually, just a few things. It isn't the practice of violence. The communists were just as violent as the fascists. It is, however, a kind of theoretical approach to violence. That violence and militarization are really what you want to do up to a certain point, because there is among the fascists a therapeutic theory of violence. Most political movements, whether they're moderate or whether they're extreme, say, well, yes, in some circumstances, we have to practice violence. The British and the Americans say, well, we're in total war in World War II, and we're going to drop a lot of bombs on the Germans and Japanese, and we're going to incinerate hundreds of thousands of German and Japanese civilians. And this is what normally would be called a war crime. It's a horrible thing, but we have to do it because they've attacked us, supposedly, and this is total war, and it is a necessary evil. Communists have the same theory of violence. No one more violent than communists. But they say the goal is a utopia of perpetual peace. That's the goal, and violence, even on a mass scale, is merely a temporary, necessary evil. What is different about fascist violence? Basically, the doctrine coming out of radical European culture and the European Cultural Revolution of the late 19th century, that violence is good for you, that it has useful characteristics. This was perhaps first clearly announced by the French political philosopher Georges Sorel, S-O-R-E-L, Georges Sorel, at the beginning of the 20th century, in his book, The Reflections on Violence, when he said that the practice of violence is moral and moralizing. Violence makes you a better person. How does violence make you a better person? It makes you more serious. It makes you more idealistic. It takes you out of narrow egotism. It commits you to a broader goal. You are, if necessary, sacrificing your own well-being for the broader ideal goal of other people and of the nation. It creates a sense of solidarity. Violence brings people together. Violence can create community, and community is better than individualism. It brings people together in a productive, beneficial association, and so on down the line. In other words, what I call a therapeutic theory of violence. That violence is therapy, is necessary, is good for you, and you don't want to get rid of it. It's not a necessary evil. It's kind of a basis for a life of reality and vitality. What you have to do to get along in the world, to prosper in the world. And it makes your society a higher quality, more idealistic, more unified, more vigorous, more achieving kind of society. So there is that orientation toward the positive or therapeutic theory of violence in fascists that you find in Italy and Germany and other European countries during the 1930s that differentiates themselves from other revolutionary movements that practice just as much violence in their own way. Fascists do not have an economic theory, but they have an economic orientation. The Italians called it corporatism, but in fact, there are all different kinds of corporatism. It's just like nationalism. The Germans were a little simpler about it and had less theory and more practice. The Germans called it National Socialism. National Socialism is really a very common economic approach, and it originated in the late 19th century in Central Europe, in the German-speaking lands, particularly in Germany and Austria and the German Sudetenland and what became temporarily Czechoslovakia, and also among the Slavic Czech population as well. In fact, the most successful National Socialist Party from beginning to end was the Czech National Socialist Party, suppressed by the Germans because it was very serious about its National Socialism. The idea of National Socialism originally is that socialism is useful, but only should be employed to the extent that you can really derive some good from socialism. Too much socialism is stultifying and kills your economy, but you need a certain amount of socialism regulated by the state, regulated by the national interest to benefit the ordinary population and the lower classes, but you don't want to eliminate private property because maintaining private property is necessary for the well-being of society. It makes people responsible. It makes people hardworking. It makes people pay attention and do their best. So you have to maintain private property with a certain amount of state-coordinated National Socialism. Well, that kind of philosophy has become a very broad, internationally shared philosophy by many political movements in the 20th century and in the 21st century. You find it in quite a few different countries. What is, as the Chinese say, socialism with Chinese characteristics other than National Socialism, their kind of socialism, not Soviet socialism, not Swedish social democracy, Chinese socialism. It's a form of National Socialism. And you might say that National Socialism has become, perhaps even more than neoliberalism, Western style, the most common kind of general political economy approach in the world by the 21st century. So that was the basis of fascist economics. They were not communists, they were not pure socialists, they were national socialists, or as they called themselves in Italy, national corporatists, bringing private property and a kind of worker organization, a semi-socialism together for combining both aspects of the economy for the common good. They had a few other characteristics of that kind as well. For example, rather than forming a party militia as the communists did, the fascists in their rise to power tended to create of their frontline membership a kind of party army. That is, the party itself was a military organization of a paramilitary kind, a party army to a greater degree even than one would find in Russian communism. So therapeutic violence, the party army, the National Socialist or National Corporatist orientation in economics, or possibly, but many different kinds of polities engage in aggressive war, not just fascists. So you can't say that aggressive war is merely a fascist characteristic. It's been going on since the start of recorded time. You'll find aggressive war in South Asia as long as there's been any kind of history in South Asia and so on. So aggressive war is not a unique fascist characteristics. It is a fascist characteristic, but not uniquely so. Another characteristic of fascism is a revolutionary movement that practices chronologically the reverse revolution. Fascist movements developed in European countries. European countries by the 1920s all had modern constitutional systems, bar none. Some more authentic, some less authentic, but they all had them. Therefore, you could not come to power by revolutionary insurrection, the way the communists did in Russia, where all the institutions had broken down. You could only come to power by means of practicing politics and working the system and following the Popular Front strategy. People think of the Popular Front as a communist strategy from 1935 on, but the Popular Front, as a kind of right-wing alliance, was developed by the fascists, first in Italy and then again in Germany. Popular Front really was the fascist strategy for winning power. There were two strategies in interwar Europe for revolutionary regimes to come to power. The Bolshevik strategy was that of tactical, violent insurrection, take over in a coup d'etat or a civil war, as Lenin did in Germany. The fascist strategy was to come to power by means of forming an alliance and working the system not from the outside in, but from the inside out. That's how Mussolini came to power, peacefully, as a parliamentary prime minister in Italy in 1922. Hitler tried the communist tactic and very nearly lost his life trying to participate in an insurrection against the government in 1923. And after that time, Hitler saw that Mussolini really understood European politics better than he did, and he followed fascist tactics in Italy. You had to work the system not from the outside in by means of a coup d'etat, but from the inside out by practicing politics, by participating in elections, by winning support, and by forming alliances to boost you into power. And so this really meant a kind of reversal of revolutionary priorities. The communist idea was to take over and impose war communism, as Lenin did in Russia. It was a disaster. Even Lenin had to back off from that. What Hitler found was that Mussolini was right. You had to reverse the revolutionary priorities. You had to come to power while nominally accepting the existing system and then proceed from the basis of legitimate power to revolutionize the system from the inside out rather than from the outside in, like the communists. So it was the reverse revolution of seizing power through the fascist strategy of forming alliances, the Fascist Popular Front. And in fact, that has been the strategy of virtually all radical and revolutionary parties in developed parliamentary systems, not merely in Europe, but all over the world since the 1930s. The fascist strategy has become predominant because the fascists were the first to make it work. Nothing succeeds like success. Even the communists found by 1935, after trying to foment a revolution for 20 years in Europe and other countries, also in some Asian countries as well, trying to foment revolution, but the only revolution they could really pull off was in Russia. Everything else failed for nearly 20 years. So then at the Congress of the Communist International in Moscow in 1935, the Soviets pulled out the strategy of the Popular Front. Well, what was the Popular Front? The Popular Front was the communists, finally, after nearly 20 years, adopting the fascist strategy for seizing power. Rather than trying to overthrow the system in coup d'etat and civil war, They would work the system. They would participate even more in the system. They would form political alliances and come to power gradually, working toward revolution from inside the system rather than outside the system. This became the new communist strategy in 1935. It was simply the communization of the fascist strategy, because for one generation, the fascists proved to be more expert revolutionary politicians than the communists had been. So you have a few specific fascist characteristics in terms of economics, the party army, therapeutic violence, the reverse revolution, the fascist strategy of popular alliances. These are fascist characteristics. The other characteristics people think of as fascist really are common to many different kinds of radical movements. The charismatic leader, authoritarianism, forming a mass party. That's happened all over the world in various different forms. These are just characteristics of mass radical politics and not of fascism. Therefore, you have to be very specific, very empirical in your approach in defining what is really fascist and the vexed question of uh, who is a fascist. Maybe that's a good point at which to stop now and see if you have any questions. This kind of discussion, of course, can go on all day because it has many different variants. You have different sets of fascist characteristics in different countries that had significant fascist movements. There are about a half a dozen countries in Europe that had significant fascist movements you can look at. What you have to remember is that even during the so-called fascist era, fascism was not that popular. In Europe, the heartland of historic fascism, there were always more anti-fascists than there were fascists. In politics, everyone has the idea of using factors and forces to his advantage. And so there were non-fascists who wanted to use fascism against communism, and there are communists in turn who wanted to form alliances with fascists in other countries to help them promote civil war and overturn the system. But these people were not fascists. They were just people who had ideas about how to exploit fascism for their own advantage. There are really only a half dozen countries that had significant fascist movements, and most of those had fascist movements only for short periods of time. So it's easy to exaggerate the historical importance of fascism, even in the fascist era. Even in the fascist era, there wasn't that much fascism or that many fascists. Fascism always had more opponents than it had supporters. And what made fascism important was not basic fascism, that is Italian fascism, the creation of fascism, the first use of the term, the invention of the word in Italy. What made fascism important was calling the Hitler movement in Germany fascist, which, as I have said before, it never did, because the Hitler movement in Germany, taking over Germany, one of the most dynamic countries in the world, made fascism an epochal phenomenon that threatened to dominate an historical period in the 1930s and 1940s and had a major impact in Asia and other parts of the world, as well as in Europe. That was what was really important about generic fascism, not fascism per se, but simply Hitlerism and National Socialism in Germany.
Received a couple of questions in the chat box that I'll be reading out to you. It's on direct messages. Right. So, Shub has asked a question. How differently do you define, let's say, reactionaries and fascists? So, for instance, if you subscribe to the concept of generic fascism as a phenomenon, would you come up with a similar phenomenon such as generic, let's say, reactionary movements or something similar on those lines? How do you distinguish, let's say, reactionary movements from fascist movements in the current day and age?
The original approach here was the communist approach. in 1923, was to say there is no distinction, that fascism is really the ultimate in the reaction, not because it is more reactionary than ordinary reactionaries, but because it is more radical and more violent and more dangerous, so that fascism is the ultimate reaction. In fact, one has to be able to distinguish empirically between what I defined as the three phases of authoritarian nationalism in Europe in the 1920s and 30s, really to understand radical politics during that period. That is, moderate authoritarianism, the reactionary radical right, which was a more extreme sort of authoritarianism, and fascism, which was radical and even revolutionary. The moderate authoritarian right was willing to continue to maintain even a degree of parliamentary politics as long as it could be brought under control and could be dominated by new sets of laws and rules. The genuine reactionary radical right was reactionary because it harkened back to traditional institutions, wanted to restore traditional forms, wanted to go back to the old ways. The reactionary really refers to the old ways and not to radical new ways. Fascists were revolutionaries, but they were revolutionaries with a difference, and in some respects, as I tried to indicate before, went about it in quite a different way than the communists did. Fascists did not want to restore any historical institution. They wanted to only create their new radical institutions politically. There was no restorationism, no neo-traditionalism in fascism. And the truly reactionary is restorationist and neo-traditionalist. That's the difference with fascism. Also, one finds that with the strategy, the fascist strategy in politics, one has the phenomenon, as I indicated before, of the reverse revolution. That fascism only comes to power in terms of cooperating with the existing system.
Mm.
Communism comes to power originally by overthrowing the existing system. Fascism can't do that. It's operating in different kinds of countries. It has to cooperate with the existing system, and so it can't simply overthrow it altogether. It has to work at it by a kind of reverse process of being more moderate to begin with, and then more radical later on, until the consummation of the fascist revolution. This was never achieved in Italy. The Italians never completed the fascist revolution. The Italians invented the term of totalitarianism. Then Italian fascist theorists complained every year after that, well, we haven't really become genuinely totalitarian yet. When do we become totalitarian? It's a matter of completing the fascist revolution. In Italy, the fascist revolution was never completed. In the last 2 years of Mussolini's life, under German military occupation, the Italian fascists began a kind of worker radical socialism. And now we're coming nearer full totalitarianism and the revolutionary economic potential of fascism. That was only in the last 2 years of Mussolini's life and under German control, so they never really fully carried it out. So the reversal of revolutionary priorities is part of the fascist strategy of coming to power and of using power and developing it. The fascist revolution was only going to be complete after fascism had worked out its full power dynamic and its complete takeover of all power. And that involved a certain amount of military aggression. In the case of Nazi Germany, an enormous amount of military aggression, which was never completed. So that reversal of revolutionary priorities is there in communism, whereas the truly reactionary is neo-traditionalist and restorationist, harking back to the past and not to something which is radical and new. In terms of their own goals, the fascists were about as revolutionary as the communists were, but in terms of their contemporary practices, they were always more moderate and more compromising. And this leads to a good deal of analytic uncertainty and confounds many students and analysts.
Thank you, sir, for that response. The reference to communism is there in another question by Onshu when he asks, do you think that there is such a term as red fascism? And he says here, I was reading in one of Bertrand Russell's essays that Lenin exhibited a great deal of satisfaction while talking to Russell once, when he recounted how he deliberately incited the poorer peasants to go and kill the richer ones, the kulaks, uh, in a particular context of violence. Would you say that this falls under your definition of therapeutic violence, this sort of satisfaction at going and inciting people to go and, let's say, kill the richer ones?
Uh, to a degree, possibly, but again, you have to look at the theory. What one finds in progressive politics is that part of society has to be reformed. And one place you begin is with the criminal part of society, those whom you define as criminal. And that the function, therefore, of prison, of incarceration, is to reform people so that you can get rid of prisons, theoretically. And you are imprisoning them for their own good. Incarceration should be therapeutic. Now, the theory in communism only goes as far as the old progressive theory of therapeutic incarceration. They are learning to be different, better people as they are incarcerated. And that's the theory of the Gulag. They are there for their own good. And there has to be millions of them because there are millions of people who have criminal tendencies, we find, in existing corrupt society, and they must be reformed. But this is all for their own good. Millions of them may die in the process. Well, that's too bad, but that's a necessary evil. Yes, there is an analogy here, certainly. There is an analogy here in communism and in some other kinds of authoritarian regimes. But the outright practice of violence itself, not just incarceration and what we might call authoritarian instruction, outright violence and killing people, there was that tendency on the part of fascists, which was more extreme. And therapeutic violence then was a fascist characteristic. Now, at the same time, we have to understand that fascists were caught in a bind, in a contradiction with their own propaganda. You're not going to be the leader of a large civilized country like Italy and Germany saying, we're going to practice violence on a large scale because violence is good for you. This sounds crazy. So the fascists didn't talk in those simplified, gross terms. They introduced paramilitary training and propaganda and education about the military virtues and violence, which proceeded indirectly toward this goal. They had always to proceed indirectly toward that goal. That's true of most, not all dictatorships, but of most dictatorships. They disguised their ugliest parts from their own people. It was true in the Soviet Union. There were never in the Soviet Union public executions. In Western countries in the old days, there were public execution. In the United States, in the early 19th century, you could go out to see a public hanging of one or two criminals. And that was a big show in a society that had no mass entertainments. To go out and see a public hanging, a public execution, was really a kind of a form of entertainment, and so on. Now, the modern dictatorships always hide their crimes. Stalin never wanted Russian people to see mass incarceration, to see mass executions. This was always done secretly or privately as much as possible. Hitler never wanted Germans to see the final solution of the Jews, and so on down the line. So the actual discourse, even of fascists part of the time, was quite different. They only brought out this tendency toward therapeutic violence in certain kinds of controlled ways and controlled circumstances because it was simply too strong a medicine for most people to accept and to understand if they did it whole hog. They were very careful to proceed with indirection about it to try to form the new man and the new society. The basic idea here is simply the revolutionary new man. All revolutions look to creating the new man. Soviet Union always talked about the new Soviet man, the new kind of human being that will be educated in a different way, have different values, different way of living, different way of thinking, different way of leaving an historical legacy. And the fascists use that sort of discourse actually even more than the Soviets. The official newspaper of the Romanian fascists was simply called Omul Nou, the new man, because this was the goal. Fascism was creating a new kind of human being. And the German Nazis carried it to the greatest extreme because they were proposing, among their most radical sectors, to create a new kind of physiological human being in a certain sense. They were creating a new man that would be racially new. Because the most radical, the most advanced Nazis had the idea of rebreeding the German nation. They recognized that the Germans were a composite people, like all peoples. They're made up of different kinds of people, different characteristics, different physical appearances, and so forth. And they had to create a purified German race. Hitler always admitted privately, Germans are not a pure race. They're just made up of different kinds of people in Central Europe. You had to create a pure race, a biological new man. And that was the most radical and revolutionary proposition of all, to create the new man, not by education, not by training, but through biology and breeding, the breeding of the revolutionary new man. That was an extreme position that was not even characteristic of all Nazis. And you won't see it in most other fascist movements. But that was the most extreme characteristic of the fascist politics and new values, to create not merely a new man generally, but a new human being through racial breeding and eugenics. But that, again, I say, was not fully characteristic of all fascisms.
Right, sir. We have a question from Animesh here, who asks something that is contemporary yet classic in some sense, because he asks, how do you evaluate Robert Paxton's change of mind when he said that January 6th, 2021, when the Capitol Hill was stormed, was a point of inflection for him in some sense, when that led him to impute a fascist characteristic to Trump and the Make America Great Again movement. So, how do you evaluate Professor Paxton's work and this particular change in form in time?
Professor Paxton, of course, is one of the most prominent of our contemporary fascistologists, pretty much contemporary of mine. He's only 2 years older than I am. And in general, I thought that he did a pretty good job in a set of interviews in saying that whatever you think of Trump, however many negative characteristics you may find in Trump or impute to him, he is not the same sort of thing as an historical European fascist. And then to find that the January 6th riot was a calculated insurrection to seize power. I would say that Professor Paxton is not a very good political analyst. He's getting a bit soft here because, of course, the January 6th was a typical Trumpism that is very confused, not well organized, and not thought out. It certainly was intended to have some kind of political effect, but the idea was to have a big rally here and a big demonstration that in some kind of almost magical way was going to influence the congressman to change the registration of the vote. Now, if you look at this as a political plan, it was purely fantastic. An external riot and demonstration is not going to bring the American Congress to change the registration of the vote. And Trump's own vice president was very clear on that. He said ahead of time, we have the rules and there is no alternative but to apply the regulations and register the vote. There has been one election. There are not two elections. We have one election and we have to register the vote in the election that actually physically exists. He was quite clear on that. So there seems to have been a kind of magical thinking in Trump's mind that a great show of popular enthusiasm was going to sway the vice president and going to sway Republican Party legislators. But it did not. It did not. It was the sort of thing that you find in a good many radical politicians. We're going to have a big public demonstration, and that will show the legislators, this will show public opinion that there are so many of us and there's such intense feeling and so much determination behind us that they're just going to have to pay attention to this and they're going to have to act accordingly. And you look at all of the major demonstrations in American politics and in other Western politics in the past two generations, and none of them have had any effect unless they are coordinated to become part of practical political organization in the immediate future. There have been a few, like the civil rights movements in the United States, coordinated to become part of practical politics that were a political success, but they achieved success only through normal political means. All the mass demonstrations were simply a public expression, but not part of the legislative process, simply an encouragement. And the idea that somehow a public demonstration was going to change the legislative process is extreme fantasy, simply magical thinking. And Trump has been guilty of magical thinking on more than one occasion, but he's not the only one. Many political extremists engage in magical thinking. You have people in India who engage in magical thinking. Very common. The difference was that Trump here was the outgoing president of the United States, and he could engage in magical thinking, bringing people together for a mass demonstration in Washington at the time of the registration of the American vote. He was simply applying it to a practical occasion, but it was no different from the kinds of magical thinking you find of many people promoting many different kinds of mass demonstrations. As far as an insurrection plan, there was never any insurrection plan. That was much too complicated, and there was never any brandishing of guns. You can't really have an insurrection without the use of armed force. There was no brandishing of guns. The only firing of a gun was by a police officer who killed, rather wantonly, an unarmed woman demonstrator rioting into the Capitol building. So there was no insurrection. There was no plan to take over. There was a riotous demonstration based on magical thinking, which was never worked out coherently in Trump's own mind. He didn't really know what to do after the whole thing got going, and he just stayed quiet all afternoon while the riot played out. It was all beyond him. And indeed it was beyond him because it didn't make any sense. And he had no practical plan.
The way you started off with that answer reminded me of one of your articles that I read on Russia, where you responded to attempts by scholars like Timothy Snyder when they have coined this or certainly popularized terms like I think rashism or a portmanteau from Russian fascism, when they say that all right, what Putin is doing is also some sort of neo-fascism. And you made a similar comment when you said that Professor Snyder is not a good political analyst when he made those comments. How else would you, let's say, view Putin and Russia, especially with the Russia-Ukraine war in light?
Uh, Putin is a right-wing Russian dictator, the very obvious opposite of a neo-communist, as he has sometimes been described. Very much a figure of Russian evolutionary politics, very much in the line of Russian nationalist leaders. The curious thing about Putin, in terms of all of these charges of racism and Putinist fascism, is that Putin has tried to be something very different. The term reactionary was introduced just a few minutes ago. Putin has tried to be a right-wing reactionary authoritarian. Putin has tried to restore a kind of analogy. You can't restore the past, but you can restore attempted analogies with the past. And he is a reactionary Russian politician who has tried to restore an analogy with the Russian past. He wants not to be the new Stalin. He's never had any illusions of the Soviet Union as such, as the Soviet Union could ever be restored. He's trying to be the new Nicholas I. He's trying to be the new Tsar. And Nicholas I, of course, under his Minister of Education and Culture, Uvarov, introduced the trilogy of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. And this is pretty much the ideology of Putin restoring Nicholas I. He's Uvarov all over again, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. He's tried to make Russia a Christian country and a Christian regime, which is a remarkable stretch. But it's really going back to the Russian old regime, which was always ultra-Orthodox and philosophically, officially, institutionally, ultra-Christian. Autocracy in the sense of Tsarist autocracy, not of the organization of a communist party. No mass movement, fascist style, has brought Putin to power. Putin was instituted from the top down, as in the communist system. And the political organization that Putin has been organized by the government. It never brought Putin to power at all. He was simply installed by the personal designation of the preceding Russian president. This is a typical Russian transmission of power and has no similarity to a fascist coming to power whatsoever. There is no genuine mass movement. There is only the political party and the political militia created by Putin in power to support the existing regime. There is no takeover. No takeover was necessary. This is a Russian deal, as Russian succession has always been a kind of deal ever since the 17th century, or 300 years. The very opposite. So that Putin theoretically has no doctrine of fascism, has no doctrine of violence, has no doctrine of war, has no genuine party army, and doesn't have the problem of following a fascist strategy because he already has power and exercises power from the government itself. The best analysis, I think, of the character of Putin's authoritarianism in terms of its Russianism is by the French Russianologist Marlène Laruelle. And there is one or two English translations of Laruelle, and she explains Putin really as in terms of Russian tradition and traditional Russian authoritarianism, I think perhaps more clearly than anyone else. Professor Snyder was once upon a time a very good historian. Then he decided in the 21st century that his métier was to be a political analyst and to explain certain kinds of contemporary political phenomena by means of historical analogy. And there he has become very, very confused. And in his second career, he is as unsuccessful as he was in his first career as a serious practicing historian.
That was a fascinating response, sir. Do you think you have time for one final question before
Yes,
we?
indeed. Go ahead.
This is a question by Gaurav, but I had a question before that. So, I mean, you in your book you have cited Ernst Nolte, if I may have butchered his pronunciation, but a German historian, and it reminds me of the historical right controversy in the 80s about the role of the Holocaust in the history of Nazi Germany. So, for instance, whether the Holocaust, so Ernst Nolte, for instance, argued that okay, the Holocaust was not unique in the European landscape of all the sort of different movements, often very violent, that were going on. And then your opponents to it which said that this is sort of normalizing the Holocaust. So how would you respond to this controversy and some of the views of of scholars like Professor Nolte?
Well, I have a very great respect for Ernst Nolte. He was one of the leaders in broadening the fascism debate in the 1960s. And certainly his book about Der Faschismus in seiner Epoche, Fascism in its Epoch, was one of the key books in developing the fascism debate. That book, when translated into English by the University of Chicago Press, was called Three Faces of Fascism. And that was one of its major weaknesses because it claimed that the French reactionary monarchist movement, Action Française, was one of the faces of fascism. No, it really was not. Action Française was a monarchist reactionary movement which was trying to reestablish traditionalism. And fascism is a revolutionary movement that is anti-traditionalist. So there was a fundamental flaw in Professor Nolte's fascistology there. Nonetheless, I have great respect for him. He's a powerful German historian. Now, in terms of his argument about Hitlerian extremism and Stalinist extremism, and the precedent being in the Soviet Union, he was kind of half right. Well, of course, it's hard to be half right. You really can't be half right and half wrong. You can simply make some valid points, but you can't really be merely half right. He was right to show that the Nazis did not invent modern genocide. They didn't invent modern mass murder. That was invented, in a sense, by the Turks during World War I in the genocide of the Armenians, and Hitler was very much aware of that. So that Hitler's precedent was probably as much Turkish as it was Soviets. The Soviets were the great practitioners of mass murder during the 1930s, and even at the beginning of the 1940s, with the carrying out of the Katyn liquidation of the Polish elite, when about 23,000 Polish elite, mainly army officers, were liquidated en masse by the Soviets. The Soviets certainly participated in mass killing and got away with it very nicely as long as they had a self-contained totalitarian system, and Hitler did take notice of that. However, the Nazi Holocaust was something rather different yet. This was the genocide of an ethnic group. Now, Stalin practiced many genocides because Stalin believed by the late 1930s that one of the great dangers to his dictatorship were the fact that you had non-Russian minorities inside Russia who would be inclined to be anti-communist. And he had in mind Finns in northwestern Russia, Polish people in western Russia, Germans in southern Russia, Koreans in eastern Siberia, and so forth, and carried out his own mini holocausts against those people. But again, he only slaughtered tens of thousands of people, not nearly 6 million people. So the Holocaust was unique, but Hitler did pay attention to other countries. And he did say, look, the Turks got away with it in World War I. We can do it even more successfully and get away with it in World War II. And he did pay attention to the Soviet Union. And as the war went on, Hitler had a higher and higher opinion of the Soviet Union and wanted to emulate Stalin more and more. He said Stalin really knows how to do things because he's got Stalin well organized in a totalitarian way, and Germany has not executed the full plan of what you would call totalitarianism, which was never a German term, an Italian term, but not a German term. That's what I mean by the reverse revolution. The fascists were aiming toward the revolution in the long run. They never got there. The Soviets concentrated on what Stalin called in the 1920s, revolution in one country. Complete the revolution in your home country, close out all outside influences, and then you can propose to export the revolution to other countries later on. The reverse revolution, or the reversal of revolutionary priorities was characteristic of fascism. And that's an aspect of fascist politics that Knowlton never got around to analyzing. He kind of gave up on fascism at a certain point and would not carry the analysis of historical fascism further, though he had in many ways a first-rate historical mind. And the historical strike was about a real conflict because Knowlton's analogy was incomplete and inadequate. It was not merely right. At most, it was about 49% right, but you can't exactly be 49% right. So he was ostracized in the historical strike, and there was an understandable reason for that. But of course, Hitler was operating within the context of a history of mass murder and genocide, and he was influenced by the history of that mass murder and genocide. And to that extent, Knowlton, in fact, was right. So thank you very much. It's been an enjoyable discussion, and I hope it's been useful for you. Perhaps we'll have occasion to continue it on some further opportunity.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very
much, sir,
much.
for your time.